The morning of June 21st, 1943, in the sweltering heat of the Pearl Harbor submarine base repair shop, Chief Torpedo Men's mate James R. Hughes stood over a disassembled Mark 14 torpedo with the kind of quiet fury that comes from watching men die for nothing. In his grease-stained hands he held a firing pin that should have been impossible to bend. Yet there it was, compressed like soft clay. For 18 months, American submarines had been firing these weapons at Japanese ships with a success rate that made Russian roulette look reliable. Commanders reported hit after hit that failed to detonate. Crews watched through periscopes as torpedoes struck enemy hulls and bounced off like rubber balls. The official line from the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington was always the same: operator error, bad aim, faulty technique. But Hughes had just discovered something that would turn the entire narrative inside out. The torpedoes weren't failing because submariners couldn't shoot straight. They were failing because the Navy had sent them to war with a weapon that had never been properly tested, that violated basic physics, and that the bureaucracy refused to admit was broken even as it cost American lives with each patrol. This is the story of how a handful of mechanics in the Pacific, working against their own Navy's command structure, fixed what Washington insisted wasn't broken, and in doing so, transformed the submarine war from an exercise in frustration into the most devastating commerce-raiding campaign in naval history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In December 1941, when Japanese bombs turned Pearl Harbor into a burning graveyard, the United States Navy possessed what it believed to be a war-winning advantage in undersea warfare. The fleet submarine force, led by boats like the Gato and Tambor classes, represented the cutting edge of naval technology. Long-range vessels capable of patrolling deep into enemy waters for months at a time. These submarines were designed to do what surface ships could not: penetrate Japanese defensive screens, strike at the heart of enemy commerce, and strangle the resource-starved island empire by cutting its maritime lifelines. The weapon system at the center of this strategy was the Mark 14 torpedo, a technological marvel that had absorbed millions of Depression-era dollars in development. It carried a 643-pound Torpex warhead, 50% more powerful than TNT. It ran on steam generated by burning alcohol and compressed air, giving it a range of 4,500 yards at 46 knots or 9,000 yards at a more conservative 31 knots. Most revolutionary of all, it featured the Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder, a secret device so classified that submarine commanders weren't allowed to examine it, let alone test it. This exploder was supposed to detonate the EZ warhead when it passed through the magnetic field beneath a ship's keel, breaking the target's back and guaranteeing a kill. On paper, the Mark 14 was the most advanced torpedo in the world. In the cold reality of combat, it was about to become one of the greatest weapons failures in American military history. The faith placed in the Mark 14 wasn't blind optimism. It was the result of decades of institutional momentum. The torpedo's development had begun in the 1920s when the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance started working on a weapon that could outperform anything in foreign arsenals. The magnetic exploder concept came from German innovations during World War I, when Kaiserliche Marine engineers had experimented with magnetic pistols to maximize damage against British capital ships. American designers saw the potential and ran with it. Throughout the 1930s, as war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, the Bureau of Ordnance poured resources into perfecting the system. But there was a problem that would have catastrophic consequences. The Mark 14 was never properly tested under realistic combat conditions. Live fire tests were expensive. Each torpedo cost approximately $10,000 in Depression-era money, equivalent to roughly $200,000 today. The Bureau conducted only 2 live-fire tests of the complete weapon system before 1941, both under controlled conditions that bore little resemblance to actual combat. The magnetic exploder was tested even less frequently. Its classified nature meant that even submarine commanders who would stake their lives on the weapon weren't permitted to conduct their own tests. This meant that when war came, American submariners went into battle with a weapon that was essentially a prototype, its real-world performance unknown, its flaws waiting to reveal themselves in the worst possible classroom. Combat against an enemy who showed no mercy to the shipwrecked. The early war patrols seemed to confirm the optimist's faith. Lieutenant Commander Chester W. Nimitz, Jr., son of the Pacific Fleet commander, took USS Hado on patrol in January 1943 and reported what seemed to be successful attacks. Other skippers filed similar reports. They'd fired spreads of torpedoes, heard explosions, and claimed kills. But something didn't add up. When intelligence officers compared submarine commanders' claimed sinkings with Japanese shipping losses reconstructed from intercepted radio traffic and other sources, there was a disturbing gap. Boats were reporting successful attacks that hadn't actually sunk anything. More troubling were the reports that started coming back from experienced commanders who had clear shots at sitting targets and missed. Lieutenant Commander Lawson P. Ramage, later to become a Medal of Honor recipient, fired torpedoes at a stationary merchant ship from 900 yards, point-blank range, where missing should have been impossible. The torpedoes ran straight and true, struck the target's hull with clearly visible impact plumes, and didn't explode. Commander Howard Gilmore, another future Medal of Honor recipient, reported the same phenomenon: direct hits, no detonations. The pattern repeated across the submarine force. Commanders who had trained for years, who could calculate firing solutions in their sleep, were watching their weapons fail in ways that defied explanation. The torpedoes were either running too deep, passing harmlessly beneath targets, or striking ships and failing to explode, or both. Some exploded prematurely, detonating in the submarine's wake and alerting every Japanese destroyer within 20 miles. The early war patrol reports make for grim reading, pages of carefully recorded data showing that something was catastrophically wrong with America's primary submarine weapon, even as the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington insisted everything was working as designed. The bureaucratic response to these reports reveals much about the institutional culture that allowed the problem to persist. Rear Admiral William H.P. Blandy, chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, was responsible for the Mark XIV's development and had staked his professional reputation on its success. When submarine commanders began reporting failures, Blandy's response was not to investigate, but to defend. Official communications from the Bureau blamed crew incompetence, poor maintenance, and tactical errors. The magnetic exploder, being classified and theoretically brilliant, was above suspicion. The depth-keeping mechanism, never properly tested, was assumed to be functioning correctly because the specifications said it should. This created a toxic dynamic where combat commanders who reported problems were implicitly accused of incompetence, while those who claimed successes, whether real or imagined, were praised and promoted. The result was a system that actively discouraged honest reporting and delayed recognition of a problem that was costing American lives and strategic opportunities. Submarine crews found themselves in an impossible position, fighting a war with defective weapons while their own command structure refused to acknowledge the defects. They were losing battles not to Japanese skill but to American institutional failure, and the men who could see it most clearly were the ones closest to the weapons themselves, the torpedo-men and mechanics who maintained, loaded, and troubleshot the Mark XIVs that were supposed to win the war. By mid-1942, the anecdotal evidence had become a statistical crisis. SubPac headquarters, Submarine Force Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor, began compiling data from patrol reports, and the numbers were damning. Submarines were firing an average of 11 torpedoes to score 1 sinking. The theoretical hit rate for a properly aimed torpedo spread fired from optimal range should have been 60 to 70%. The actual rate was somewhere around 10%, and even that figure was generous because it counted hits that failed to detonate. Commander Charles B. Momsen, the legendary submariner who had invented the Momsen lung rescue device and understood both the technical and human sides of submarine warfare, began pushing for systematic testing. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, who took command of SubPac in February 1943, inherited this crisis and, unlike his counterparts in Washington, was willing to acknowledge it. Lockwood had spent enough time around submarines to know that when dozens of experienced commanders all reported the same problem, the problem wasn't the commanders. He authorized something the Bureau of Ordnance should have done years earlier: comprehensive, realistic testing of the Mark 14 under controlled conditions that mimicked combat. The testing program would be conducted in Hawaii, away from Washington's bureaucratic oversight, using live weapons against instrumented targets. And the men who would actually do the work, the troubleshooting, the measurements, the grinding technical detective work, were people like Chief Torpedoman's mate James Hughes, mechanics and weapons technicians who understood how things actually worked rather than how specifications said they should work. The testing began with the most basic question: was the torpedo running at the correct depth? The Mark 14 was designed to run at whatever depth the submarine commander set before firing, typically 10 feet for a magnetic shot that would pass under the target's keel, or slightly deeper for a contact shot aimed at the hull. The depth mechanism was an intricate system of bellows, pistons, and control surfaces that was supposed to sense water pressure and maintain constant depth throughout the torpedo's run. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, nobody had ever verified it worked. Hughes and his team set up a test range in waters off Kahului Island. They rigged a net with depth markers and fired torpedoes through it at various settings, recovering the torpedoes afterward to examine their condition. The results were shocking. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet were actually running at 23 to 25 feet. The depth error was consistent and massive. A torpedo aimed to pass under a destroyer's keel would instead pass harmlessly beneath it, too deep to trigger even a contact explosion if it struck the bottom of the hull. The cause, once discovered, was almost insultingly simple. The Mark 14 ran on steam generated by burning alcohol and compressed air. This propulsion system generated significant internal pressure within the torpedo body. The pressure bellows that controlled depth was located inside the torpedo, where it was exposed to this internal pressure as well as external water pressure. The designers had calculated the external pressure but had never accounted for the internal pressure pushing back on the depth-sensing mechanism. The result was that the torpedo thought it was 10 feet deeper than it actually was, and compensated by diving lower. This meant that 18 months of submarine warfare, hundreds of patrols, thousands of torpedoes fired, countless missed opportunities, had been conducted with a weapon that was running too deep to hit anything. The fix was relatively simple: recalibrate the depth mechanism to account for internal pressure. But getting authorization to implement that fix required fighting the Bureau of Ordnance, which still insisted the torpedoes were running true, and any problems were crew error. Lockwood took the test data and did something that required considerable courage. He bypassed normal channels and sent it directly to Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington. King looked at the data, looked at the Bureau of Ordnance's denials, and made a decision. In August 1942, he ordered the submarine force to deactivate the magnetic exploders and use only contact mode, direct hits on the hull. This solved one problem, but immediately revealed another. Even when torpedoes hit targets at the correct depth, they still weren't exploding reliably. The testing shifted to the contact exploder itself, and this is where the story becomes both technical and personal, because the men who solved this problem did so by systematically dismantling assumptions that had been treated as gospel. The Mark 14's contact exploder used a firing pin mechanism that was supposed to be triggered by impact with a ship's hull. The pin would be driven backward by the force of impact, striking a primer that would detonate the main warhead. The system had been designed in peacetime by engineers who understood physics but had never tested their design against actual ship armor at combat angles. Hughes and his team began conducting drop tests, literally dropping torpedo warheads from a crane onto armored plates to see what would happen at various angles of impact. What they discovered was a design flaw so basic it seemed impossible that it had made it into production. When a torpedo struck a target at an oblique angle, which was the norm in combat, since submarines rarely achieved perfect 90-degree shots, the impact generated a shear force that bent the firing pin before it could move far enough backward to strike the primer. The pin was made of relatively soft steel and was too long for its diameter. Under oblique impact, it would compress or bend rather than driving straight back. The torpedoes were hitting targets, but the force that should have detonated them was instead being absorbed by a deformed firing pin that never completed its travel. Even at perfect 90-degree impacts, there was another problem. The firing pin could move so fast that it would actually bounce backward off the primer before the primer had time to initiate the detonation sequence. The exploder needed a contact time of several milliseconds to reliably function, but a high-speed impact against a steel hull could compress and release the firing pin in less than a millisecond. These were not exotic edge cases. These were standard combat conditions. The Mark 14 had been designed to work in ideal circumstances that rarely occurred in actual warfare. When it encountered real combat conditions, it failed in multiple overlapping ways. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The solution to the firing pin problem came not from Washington engineering offices, but from the machine shops and technical spaces of Pearl Harbor's submarine base. Hughes and his fellow torpedo men couldn't redesign the entire exploder system. That would require manufacturing changes, new specifications, and the kind of bureaucratic approval that would take years. What they could do was modify the existing design using the tools and materials they had available. They shortened the firing pin, reducing its tendency to bend under shear force. They changed the spring tension to slow down the pin's travel time, giving the primer more opportunity to initiate. They experimented with different impact angles against steel plates, measuring what worked and what didn't, with the kind of empirical rigor that should have been applied before the weapon ever entered service. Each modification was tested, measured, and documented. The work was painstaking and unglamorous. Hours in machine shops, grinding metal, adjusting tolerances, running the same tests over and over to verify results. These were not engineering PhDs working with unlimited budgets. These were enlisted men and junior officers, most of whom had learned their trades in the Navy or in civilian jobs before the war, applying practical knowledge and refusing to accept that the weapon was unfixable just because the official specifications said it should work. By June 1943, they had developed a modified contact exploder that worked reliably at angles from 30 to 90 degrees, that didn't suffer from firing pin deformation, and that could be retrofitted to existing torpedoes using shipboard facilities. The modification required machining new pins, adjusting spring assemblies, and recalibrating the impact sensitivity, work that could be done by submarine tender crews at forward bases. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Getting these modifications approved and distributed to the fleet required navigating a bureaucratic minefield. The Bureau of Ordnance still insisted there was nothing wrong with the Mark 14. Admiral Blandy, whose career was tied to the weapon's reputation, continued to blame submarine commanders for the failures. The official position was that any modifications made in the field were unauthorized and potentially dangerous, tampering with a precision weapon system. Lockwood found himself in the uncomfortable position of knowing his mechanics had solved a critical problem while lacking the authority to officially implement their solution. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: combat results. Several submarine commanders, frustrated with the official torpedo and willing to risk court-martial, had already been implementing field modifications based on rumors and informal communication networks. USS Tinosa, under Commander Lawrence R. Daspit, had achieved remarkable success with modified torpedoes in July 1943. USS Wahoo, under the legendary Commander Dudley Walker Morton, reported similar improvements. When these patrol reports reached Washington, complete with documented sinkings and undeniable success rates, the bureaucratic position became impossible to maintain. Admiral King, who had already overruled the Bureau once on the magnetic exploder issue, stepped in again. In September 1943, he authorized fleet-wide implementation of the contact exploder modifications developed at Pearl Harbor. The authorization came with no admission that the Bureau had been wrong, just a terse order that all fleet submarines would implement the improved design. For the mechanics and torpedo men who had fought to fix the problem, the lack of acknowledgement stung. But the results spoke for themselves. The impact on submarine warfare was immediate and dramatic. In the last quarter of 1943, after the modified torpedoes entered widespread service, American submarines sank 118 Japanese ships totaling over 500,000 tons, more than double the previous quarter's total. The hit rate climbed from roughly 10% to between 50 and 60%, sometimes higher depending on combat conditions. Submarines that had previously required 11 torpedoes per sinking were now averaging 2 to 3. The weapon that had been a source of frustration and dark humor became a reliable tool of war. Lieutenant Commander Richard H. O'Kane, serving as executive officer on USS Tang before taking command of his own boat, later wrote that the difference felt like switching from throwing rocks to firing a rifle. Commanders who had developed elaborate tactics to compensate for unreliable torpedoes could now execute straightforward attacks with confidence that their weapons would perform as designed. The psychological effect on submarine crews was equally significant. Men who had risked their lives getting into attack position, who had endured depth charge attacks and enemy patrols, no longer had to wonder whether their weapons would work when they finally got a shot. The trust that had been shattered by 18 months of failures was gradually rebuilt through the simple experience of watching torpedoes do what they were supposed to do. The human cost of those 18 months is difficult to calculate precisely, but the outlines are clear. During 1942 and early 1943, American submarines conducted hundreds of war patrols with defective torpedoes. Each failed attack represented not just a missed opportunity, but a moment when the submarine was exposed to counterattack. Submarines that had to make multiple approaches because their torpedoes didn't work faced repeated exposure to Japanese destroyers and aircraft. Some boats were lost during these follow-up attacks. USS Grunion, USS Amberjack, USS Grampus, and others went down on patrols where they fired torpedoes that likely failed to perform as expected. We cannot know with certainty that better torpedoes would have saved these boats, but we know that defective weapons increased their exposure to danger and reduced their ability to end engagements quickly. Beyond the boats lost, there were strategic opportunities squandered. In the crucial first year of the war, when Japanese logistics were still adapting to their expanded empire, American submarines could have inflicted devastating losses on enemy commerce. Instead, they fired thousands of torpedoes with minimal results, allowing Japanese merchant ships to deliver troops and supplies that sustained enemy garrisons across the Pacific. The defective torpedo didn't just cost American lives. It prolonged the war by failing to disrupt Japanese logistics when they were most vulnerable. The personal stories of the men who discovered and fixed the Mark 14's flaws reveal the human side of this technical failure. Chief Torpedo Man's mate James Hughes, who had stood over that bent firing pin in June 1943, remained in the Pacific throughout the war. He served on multiple submarine tenders, training other torpedo men in the proper maintenance and modification of the Mark 14. His name appears in the maintenance logs and patrol reports of dozens of submarines, always in the context of weapons troubleshooting and repair. Hughes never received a medal for his work. There was no established award category for mechanics who fixed problems that officially didn't exist. After the war, he returned to civilian life and worked as an industrial machinist in San Diego. When interviewed in the 1950s by a naval historian, Hughes was characteristically modest about his role. "We just did what needed doing. The boys on the boats were the ones taking the risks. We just wanted to make sure their weapons worked when they pulled the trigger." That simple statement captures both the humility and the profound importance of what he and his fellow mechanics accomplished. They fixed a weapon that the experts said wasn't broken, worked around a bureaucracy that refused to acknowledge the problem, and saved lives by insisting that empirical reality mattered more than theoretical specifications. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had provided the command authority necessary to conduct the tests and implement the fixes, later wrote extensively about the Mark 14 debacle in his memoirs. He was scathing in his criticism of the Bureau of Ordnance, noting that the problems could have been discovered and fixed before the war if proper testing had been conducted. Lockwood calculated that the 18 months of defective torpedoes cost the submarine force the equivalent of 2 years' worth of sinkings, a strategic setback that had cascading effects across the Pacific campaign. He also noted that the resistance to acknowledging the problem had damaged institutional trust in ways that persisted long after the war. Submarine officers who had been told they were incompetent when they reported genuine weapons failures learned to distrust official assurances and to rely on their own judgment, even when it contradicted formal doctrine. This created a culture of independence and skepticism that served submariners well during the war, but complicated peacetime efforts to standardize procedures and maintain centralized control. The Mark 14 crisis taught a generation of naval officers that bureaucratic certainty was no substitute for empirical testing, and that institutional reputation should never take precedence over combat effectiveness. The broader lessons of the Mark 14 failure extend beyond submarine warfare. The weapon failed because it was never properly tested, because cost concerns trumped safety verification, because classification prevented the people who used it from examining it, and because bureaucratic pride prevented acknowledgement of problems. Each of these factors is a warning sign that appears in military procurement across generations and nations. The reluctance to conduct expensive live fire tests remains a constant temptation in defense acquisition. The classification of weapon systems to prevent enemy knowledge also prevents friendly scrutiny that might catch flaws. The institutional pressure to defend previous decisions rather than acknowledge mistakes shows up in every military bureaucracy that has ever existed. What made the Mark 14 case particularly instructive was that the solution came from the bottom up. from mechanics and technicians who insisted on testing, measurement, and empirical validation over theoretical assumptions. The men who fixed the torpedo weren't rebels or malcontents. They were professionals who understood that their shipmates' lives depended on weapons that worked, and who refused to accept failure just because accepting it was procedurally easier than fixing it. By the end of World War II, American submarines had sunk over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships and over 200 naval vessels, destroying roughly 55% of all Japanese shipping losses during the war. This success came despite, not because of, the weapons they had been issued at the war's start. The modified Mark 14, with its field-expedient fixes to problems that should never have existed, became one of the war's most effective weapons. But its success was built on the foundation of failure. 18 months when American submariners went into combat with defective weapons, when bureaucratic pride prevented acknowledgement of problems, and when the solution came not from the engineering offices that designed the weapon, but from the machine shops and technical spaces where men who actually understood how things worked refused to accept that the weapon was unfixable. The story of the Mark 14 is ultimately a story about the difference between theory and practice, between specifications and reality, between institutional certainty and empirical truth. It's a story about how organizations fail when they become more invested in defending their decisions than in achieving their missions. And it's a story about the unglamorous heroism of mechanics and technicians who saved lives not through dramatic battlefield actions, but through careful measurement, systematic testing, and the stubborn insistence that weapons should work before men's lives depend on them. The specific morning when Chief Hughes stood over that bent firing pin, holding physical evidence of a design flaw that bureaucrats in Washington insisted didn't exist, was not the beginning of the Mark 14 crisis. That beginning lay in the peacetime decisions to skip expensive tests and trust theoretical calculations. Nor was it the end. The full fix would take months to implement across the entire Pacific submarine force. But it was a turning point, a moment when empirical reality defeated institutional denial, when a mechanic's understanding of how metal behaves under stress trumped an engineer's confidence in untested specifications. In the broader scope of the Pacific War, the Mark 14 fix was one of hundreds of technical and tactical innovations that gave American forces their eventual advantage. But it was distinctive because it represented not just innovation, but correction, fixing what should have worked from the start, solving problems that should never have existed, and doing so over the resistance of the very institution responsible for creating the problems in the first place. The Japanese shipping losses that accelerated after September 1943 were the direct result of mechanics like Hughes and commanders like Lockwood refusing to accept that American submariners should fight with defective weapons. Every merchant ship sunk by a reliable torpedo, every tanker that failed to deliver fuel to Japanese bases, every transport that went down with troops and supplies intended for garrison reinforcement. These victories were built on the unglamorous foundation of machine shop modifications and systematic testing. The submariners who fired the torpedoes got the medals and the glory, and rightfully so, as they faced the dangers of combat. But the men who made those torpedoes work, who measured depth runs and drop-tested firing pins and ground new components on lathes, saved lives and shortened the war through the simple expedient of insisting that weapons should do what they were designed to do before men died depending on them. In the final accounting of World War II's Pacific Campaign, their contribution was as vital as any battle won or island taken, because they fixed a problem that was killing Americans not through enemy action, but through American institutional failure. The Mark 14 torpedo ended the war with a reputation as an effective weapon, and most histories of submarine warfare treat it as such, noting only briefly the early problems that were eventually resolved. This sanitized version obscures the human cost of those early problems and the institutional resistance to acknowledging them. The mechanics who discovered the flaws, the commanders who fought to get them fixed, and the submariners who went on patrol with defective weapons deserve more than a footnote acknowledging early problems. They deserve recognition for fighting a two-front war, one against the Japanese enemy and one against the American bureaucracy that sent them into combat with weapons that didn't work and then blamed them when those weapons failed. The fact that the weapons were eventually fixed is a testament to the men who refused to accept failure as inevitable, who insisted on testing and measurement over theoretical confidence, and who understood that specifications written in Washington offices meant nothing if they didn't reflect reality in the waters off Japan. Their victory was not dramatic or cinematic. It was measured in depth gauge readings and firing pin compression tests and torpedo hit rates that slowly climbed from dismal to dominant, but it was as real as any battlefield victory, and it mattered just as much to the war's outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.